1870 Census, Second Counts, Part 2. Philadelphia. Recount reasons, logistics, and census items. Philadelphia restarted my interest in 1870 second enumerations. Over 10 years ago, I created New York City's Second Count Street Index to go from an address to a census district for the one-step site. I discussed that briefly in Part 1 of this series. It's going to be a 3-part series, and I now have done the same for Philadelphia, which will be discussed in Part 3. Part 1 went over the history of 1870 recounts. And 7 locations, those locations are shown in black and blue. The recounts were done by the federal government. That also includes, by the way, Philadelphia, that's grayed out, which I've elected to do in Parts 2 and 3. The red locations did their own recounts, perhaps hoping for a federal recount later, which they did not get. And here's the upcoming Part 3 of the series. I'll show more details about it at the end. Notice the slide's background color. It's a hint. You get a star if you know what the color signifies. To get a historical perspective about this, I went online through old newspapers. Here's one of the newspaper archives that is at the Library of Congress and free. It's free to the public. Really kind of a nice site. I also subscribe to a commercial newspaper archive called newspapers.com. Late October to early November 1870 was a crucial time period for Philly. The census numbers for Philadelphia 1870 had been released a few days earlier. I call this subsection growling for a reason you will soon see. Philadelphia was expecting about 750,000 to 800,000 people on the 1870 count. The federal count was about 100,000 to 150,000 less. And so you can see by newspaper articles they were really disappointed. This was published in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It was probably a republication of one of the Philadelphia newspapers. So let's go through this. Try and get the right tone here. How the incompetent deputies have deprived Philadelphia of 1/5 her population. And the article indicated the newspaper got letters indicating whole houses and blocks were not enumerated. Based on the number of new buildings the last decade, 1860 to 1870, and about 7 people per dwelling, the population should be about 740,000. The article continues that based on new voters and a ratio of 1 to 6, 1 voter to 6 population, there should be also about 740,000 people on the 1870 count. And based on taxables, which I guess are adults less children, and 5 inhabitants for each, again, they came up with this 740,000 estimation count. They got nowhere close to that, obviously. So the article says, the census as returned by the Assistant Marshals is incorrect, and as such we repudiate it, and on behalf of the people of Philadelphia, demand that the city be again enumerated. From the facts presented above, it would appear that the population of the city, exclusive of all aliens, was about 750,000. Really upset. And to make matters worse and irritate the collective city's pride, got this article, that President Grant has directed that the census of New York shall be retaken. There are many reasons why a similar course should be adopted here, as there can be no doubt that the census of Philadelphia is more grossly inaccurate than that of New York. It is now well understood that in 1 or 2 wards of this city, where a decline of population in the last decade was reported, in the face of a large increase in the number of voters, that the assistant marshal manifestly failed to discharge his duty on account of threats of violence. And one of those wards is the 8th Ward. We'll talk about that in a second. So Philly fights back. Article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, November 1st, 1870. New York has growled. There is great virtue in a New York growl. New York insists that the returns of the census from that city are incorrect and unjust. Every other large city in the country makes similar complaint. They all growl. New York shall have its census retaken. Philadelphia believes she has been deprived of the credit of at least 100,000 persons in the enumeration. If the president wished to do justice, he will determine that our census shall be retaken and thereby establish that a Philadelphia growl is as good as one uttered at New York. So the administration got together in Philadelphia, and on November 4th, they were discussing a resolution for the appointment of a committee to consist of the mayor, the presidents of councils, and 5 citizens to proceed to Washington and request of the president that the census of Philadelphia be retaken. Was offered in Select Council yesterday, and after some discussion was postponed until next week. Well, they didn't actually have to discuss it the following week because on November 5th, it's been reported that the Honorable Alfred C. Harmer, member-elect from your 5th Congressional District, called upon Secretary Robeson, assuming he was the Secretary of the Interior, who oversaw the census, who kindly accompanied him to President Grant. Mr. Harmon explained to the president that great dissatisfaction prevailed in Philadelphia in regard to the census. After full consultation, the president directed General Walker, the superintendent of the census, to issue an order to have the census retaken, precisely as was done in the case of New York. So that's how Philadelphia got its 1870 recount. At the same time, the city was preparing for their own demonstration recount by city police of their 8th Ward. Many places that felt they were undercounted did the same strategy to put pressure on the federal government for a recount or an adjustment. One possible reason to pick this ward was that the 1860 census showed about 28,000 people, and the recent 1870 census about 20,000, a decrease of over 7,000. At the same time, their voter registrations were going up. Didn't make any sense. So they picked this 8th Ward. The city census, we'll call it the city census, would be the number of people on June 1st and on their count day of November 10th, 1870. Well, June 1st was the census date. If you were alive on June 1st, 1870, you should be on the census. So the census asked specifically on this one date, even though they had 5 months at that time to complete the census. In 1880, they reduced the amount of time to 1 month. Perhaps the November date was to catch people who left the city in summer for vacation. That's possible. So the city only took down the name of the head of family, and all else were just numbers. How many people were here? Just give me a number. The federal census marshal, in a meeting in November 10th, 1870, argued that the counts would not be comparable to his U.S. Census, where all the names were written down. So there was some variation between the counts in terms of the methodology. So they advertised this count, the city count, to the people of the 8th Ward, the city councils, with the object in view of testing in part the accuracy of the census taken during the last summer by United States officers, have decided to enumerate the residents of the 8th Ward. That in each division of said ward, 2 authorized persons will proceed to collect by going to each building Information as to the number of actual residents therein. George Hall, chairman of Committee on Census. And probably the two that were authorized were a policeman and a letter carrier. There's another article about that. So the results, and a little bit more methodology, that none have been recorded on the city count who were not known to be residents at the time named, so that the real population was greater by the amount of so many floating residents. It's also proper to say that students, as well as all strangers, travelers, and persons belonging elsewhere, have been carefully excluded from our enumeration. We have identified hundreds of persons omitted from the United States Census for June, the greater number being of absent families, but many being servants, residents at hotels, etc. Remember, these are residents at hotels, not people who may be spending a weekend in Philadelphia and are at a hotel. So that's a November 23rd article. So the results look like this. Here are the results and a prediction. So the June U.S. Census date, that enumeration produced 20,366 people in the 8th Ward. The city recount found an extra or more 2,000 more people who said they were there in June. The increase in the whole city by proportion established by this city recount is about 10% more. So they claim that, therefore, the original federal count of about 657,000 plus 10% should give you about 722,000 people. That's probably an additional 70,000 that they claim were missed. So there's pressure, even when they were doing the federal recount, that these numbers were known to do a better job. So let's actually look at the federal recount of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We have here a newspaper article that indicates that the United States Marshals Office, Eastern Division of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, November 12, 1870, 2 days after the city count. My officers will commence their duties on Tuesday next, the 15th, and I hereby most earnestly ask the cordial cooperation of all citizens for the purpose of making this enumeration full and complete. E.M. Gregory, U.S. Marshal. Now, the marshal himself didn't do the count. He hired assistant marshals, and for the recount, they used 280 census takers compared to only 92 on their first count. If you aren't sure which census sheet you're looking at, the first count should have a summer month date, the recount a November date. The first count had a 5-month count period. That changed, as I pointed out, to a single month when the whole census structure was revised. This is an important thing. So here we have a census sheet. You notice that the quality isn't that great. Be prepared for that. And the date that it was done, the enumeration was done, was in June. Here is another sheet. It has less information on it because they asked less questions. And this is dated November, outside of the first count period. It's interesting, although New York City got their recount before Philadelphia, theirs was mostly done in January. Philadelphia just jumped on it and did the recount the same month that they were given permission to have a federal recount. So the Philadelphia recount, the U.S. Census said that people who lived there on June 1st, when they did this count in June, July, whatever, were about 657,000. The official population after the second count, which was done in November, but based upon June 1st, was only about 16,800 more people, only about 2.6%. So all of the estimates that Philadelphia gave didn't turn out to be correct. In fact, there was some debate about whether they were going to ask for a third count or not, and they decided that they were lucky to get the second one. In fact, to show you the expectations of the population, here is a table, part of a table, about the 100 top biggest U.S. cities. New York is first in the 1860, Philadelphia second, and Brooklyn is third. Brooklyn was not part of New York City in 1870, and I discussed that in part 1. So you look on the right hand of the 1860, and they had growth rates, annual growth rates of 5%, rounded off 17%. So they were expecting the 1870 census to reflect the same growth rate. And if you look at the bottom right, you'll see the growth rates are reduced dramatically. Now, the argument has been made that shows an undercount, shows the problem of the 1870 census, but there are other factors involved as well, including the Civil War, and people were starting to move away from cities. Okay. So what about the 8th Ward? What happened on that? Well, remember, the U.S. Census for June said there were 20,366 people there. The city census, taken in November for people who were there in June, said there was an extra 2,000 people. And the U.S. November recount, the official account, is pretty close to that. It's a little bit under, but they had 22,285. You know, being a cynic, perhaps that's not surprising, since the federal census taker was probably aware of the city's recount numbers and wanted to be close to that number, and so they did even a more detailed survey of the 8th Ward. Now let's switch to what the census actually looks like. You should know that there's a website that has the 1870 instructions for Assistant Marshals, and I'll abbreviate those AM. AM. The website of my choice to find instructions for the various censuses is something called IPOMS or IPOMS. IPOMS, I guess, is their preferred pronunciation. This is one of my favorite go-to census sites. If you look at this site, IPOMS, they have a challenge here. The challenge is that you can identify a significant error in their database and their documentation, you get a free mug for your efforts, a free mug. Well, I can use a free mug. There's the result of my efforts. The slogan on the mug says, "Use it for good, never for evil." So what does IPOMS stand for? And actually, the mug pronounces it different. It's IPOMS rather than IPOMS. Okay, what do the abbreviations stand for? Because every time I try and figure it out, I don't remember it. I have to look it up, and it turns out that it was very difficult to do that this time on their website. It was buried in an FAQ answer, frequently asked question. What is IPOMS an acronym for? Technically, nothing. It became inaccurate to describe it as a public use microdata series, PUMS, and the I stood for integrated. Since then, we've just gone by IPOMS and no longer treated as an acronym. It's just a word that describes part of the University of Minnesota's population area, their research area. All right, so the instructions are different, obviously, for the recount. The federal recount in November only gathered the names and numbers of males and females, whites and colored, and their ages who were present in Philadelphia on June 1st. The number of dwellings, both vacant and inhabited, were also recorded. And so here at the end of an AM's route, you might see a summary. On the left are the number of dwellings. Then we have the sex, race, numbers of people. And then there's usually some sort of certification there. You can see again the quality, and this is enhanced. The quality of the filming wasn't great, and you're going to have to brush up on your cursive and old calligraphy as well when you read this information. So if you use the count's film sheets, just get used to this. So here we have a certification. What does it read? Can you read that? This is to certify that the foregoing is a correct enumeration of all the inhabitants, blah, 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 blah. Now, let me help you out here. This is to certify that the foregoing is a correct enumeration of all the inhabitants in my portion of the 52nd District of the 17th Ward in the County of Philadelphia in the Eastern District of the State of Pennsylvania. I like this because he had added, as you can see to the left, residing June 1st. So I thought that was cute, June 1st, to emphasize that. So again, some of this stuff is illegible. Hopefully the family you're interested in isn't found in one of these types of sheets. So let's see what's on the census in terms of their restrictions. Well, if it's a June 1st residency, those two people who were added probably got a question at the end. Where were you? When did you first come to Philadelphia? And those two came in August from Boston, so they crossed off the list. They're not going to be counted. Another one, a bunch of people crossed out because it says taken elsewhere, not counted. Another one, so there's a blank there in terms of the names of people at that address, and it says only resided since August in the city. That's not good enough. They had to be there from June on. The other one apparently is not occupied at all. Remember, they were counting vacant housing and also ones with people. Or this one, it says unoccupied on the 1st of June, 1870. That implies it was occupied when they went in November, but they couldn't count those people because they weren't there on June 1st. And it's also on the bottom as well, an unoccupied in something of June 1870. On 1st, I guess it's unoccupied on 1st of June 1870. Have to hesitate sometimes to read this stuff. But here's an interesting one. Here is at least one person who wasn't there in November, but was there in June. And it says here, moved since June. Moved since June. Or could even be removed since June. Now, it turns out that the regular 1870 census had a mortality schedule that recorded deaths within a year of the census date. But that schedule and that information were not part of the recount. However, you may see notes on somebody dying since June 1st, and they are counted because they were there on June 1st. They were alive. So I'll go through some of those. So here is one. Said died 19th July 1870. So that person's counted. They were there alive on June 1st. Or this one that says dead, drowned on 8th of October 1870, and it's a 5-year-old. 5-year-old. Or this sad one here, I'll blow this up, a large family, perhaps they had to have large families in those days, and the 4 youngest children, 3 of them died in July, 1 in August, including twin girls. So I looked up information about mortality in those days and found this article that said in 1870 about 175 of every 1,000 children born never survived to their first birthday. Wow. There were rampant diseases like smallpox and cholera that went through that community. Today, at least according to a March 2023 article I found online. Today, Philadelphia has about 8.4 deaths per live births, reaching their first year, versus a national rate of 5.8 deaths per 1,000 live births. So Philadelphia still has a relatively high infant mortality. Now, in terms of births, you have to realize what's happening here. So here you have on the top a 2-week-old baby, and then on the bottom, Mary is 3/12 old. That won't make sense based upon November, but it might make sense based upon June 1st. And so here to qualify it, this person says that Thomas, a male, 1/12 old, and then he puts down born in May. So in June, yes, Thomas was 1 month old, 1/12 of a year. Okay, so if they follow the rules, it's all in relationship to June 1st, 1870. Now, if you're lucky, actually, some of these AMs, these assistant marshals, didn't follow protocol. So here's one who listed occupation. Occupation, that's neat. That wasn't a requirement. Carpenter, laborer, printer of calico. Gardeners, bank president. Fancy area. Look, there's a lady. That's her occupation. She's a lady. And she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 servants and maybe a gardener with his family. Wow. Or here's one that not only did they list some of the occupations, but they also listed where they were born, their birthplace. Sometimes you'll see institutional names put on the census sheets. Again, that wasn't a requirement, and it's really too bad because the institutional names would become part of the street index I produced. But there are some institutions, and if a census taker hit a large institution, they didn't interview each individual person or get numbers that way. They actually probably went to the office and wrote down the names of people from their records. And one of them is extremely interesting. I'll show you this. Here's an 1895 map of Philadelphia. The University of Pennsylvania is on the top. UPenn, I guess it's called. And then we have a very large area with almshouses. That today is the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And so doing the street indexes, I came across this sheet and it says almshouse attendance. Okay, that's interesting. There's nothing on the top to indicate that. And then the next page on the top, it says almshouse. And now we have all the people there. We have the superintendent and his family. We have what it might be a farmer and his family. They grew their own food there. On the right, a police officer and a family, an engineer and a family, an assistant engineer and family. Continuing, and then employees in manufacturing, and then ditto DO, employees in farm and garden, employees in the hospital, employees in the insane department, employees in children's asylum, employees in men's department, employees in women's department, employees like steward, physician, storekeeper, matron, apothecary, I guess those are prescriptions, matron, teacher, steward, clerk, watchman, and then a list that went on and on and on about the inmates that were there. Someone doing some historical research, this would be a gold mine. For the first time, the recounts did addresses, both New York and Philadelphia. In 1880, it was standard procedure to see addresses. So if you use our street index, talked more about in the upcoming part 3, you want to find the street name and house number on these census sheets. You might actually not know the name of a person. You're doing history of a house. You're looking for a particular address. It may be difficult, and it might not even show the address on the census sheets, and you'll find out about that. But what I do want to hear in this section is to show you some problems of even finding street names on the sheets. Misspelling is one problem. Calligraphy is another for a lot of people. So here we have part of the 1895 map. There's a street called Somerset, 1M, 1T. The enumerator, the assistant marshal, first starts off by saying Somerset has 2 T's, 1M, on image 337. On image 339, he now has 2 M's, 1 T. And then later on, he has 1 M, 1 T. My favorite one is this one, Lloyd, in the 1895 map. And Lloyd is spelled Lloyd, L-O-I-D. Sometimes when I see these names, having the map in front of me, circa 1870, was helpful trying to figure out exactly what the real name was. And then you have a lot of emphasis on calligraphy. People wanted to show off their handwriting, and the script may be very difficult to read. In fact, my grandson can't even read script. They don't teach cursive anymore in a lot of schools. I'm going to show you a reference to Deciphering Old Handwriting. That'll be in the show notes. I'll give you some links there that might help you in trying to decipher what's on the 1870 recount. So let me show you the number of street name positions on recount sheets, so you should be aware of this, if they're present. New York City's 1870 recount had a standard placement of the street names on column 2. Philadelphia apparently had no instructions. It was the first one major city done. No instructions to the AM on where to place the street name. It's really a problem. So here's part of the New York sheet. You can see on the second column, these people are on Cedar between Church and Greenwich. Really very nice. Actually, I did the street index off of a map, an 1870 map. I could have actually done it directly off of the census sheets. So in Philadelphia, the street name could be in the very top. The problem is that when they filmed it, it could be cut off, and you couldn't quite figure out the name. It could be on the Inhabitants Inn. In this case, it's Dickinson, it looks like. 4th Street is put in the tabletop. Another place. Could be in the left side. That's the worst place. It looks to me like they're scanning from a bound book of census pages, and the pages are filled out on both sides. So on the top, you were looking straight down at the bound volume. The binding is on the left. The margin is much thinner, not as wide. And the one on the bottom, the left margin is free, so that's the back of the page as well. So, and in both cases, they've been cut off because they're trying to write down the street names horizontally rather than along the edge. Very difficult. I hated when I saw street names on the left margin. Or it could be on the right side of the lines. So here on the top, you see it's 12th Street. And notice that the person doesn't go around the block like a typical numerator did from 1880 on. Instead, he went 12th Street. This is the same page. And then he did somebody on 13th Street. And then he did somebody on 14th Street. 14th Street is Broad Street. Very interesting. We'll talk about the routes of Assistant Marshals in 1870 in Part 3. So I hope you enjoyed that overview of the Philadelphia Census. Part 3 is going to talk about the street index, finder aids, and census films. It's going to give you an insight into the problems of producing that. And a more detailed look at the topics I'm going to cover are wards and census divisions, census takers consistency, use of city directory, use of city directory because they have street indexes, which also includes wards. That's really kind of cute. Use of 1880 census as the last resort to find the area and get some street names. Lots of rural areas in Philadelphia in 1870 with no house numbers or street names. How to use finder aids and census film problems. And so, if you're wondering what that background color is, here is a hint for you. This has been another of my JDW talks. I have YouTube talks on genealogy topics, census resources, Ellis Island immigration, natural history topics, virtual birding field trips, birding optics, Orange County birds, and other things of interest to me like novelty zithers and biology songs. So I hope you're enjoying this series. I'm going to put part 3 up within hopefully a week on that. Have fun in your family history research.